Okay,
Now I'm really ready. Yeah.
Our mics are on, which is a very strong signal from the staff that we should start. I take that as a signal. So it's my pleasure to start us and to host our beginning. My name is Peter Gourevitch. I'm a professor of political science here, and I'm happy to start this. I came here to be in the political science department some 40 years ago, to believe it or not. And I was chair of the department for a little while, and then I became asked to help develop what's now our School of Global Policy and Strategy, of which Jesse is a professor. And we're here to listen to Jesse, so let me talk to you a little bit about him. I'm very proud of Jesse. He joined us a little over 10 years ago. He was an undergraduate at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Then he went and got a PhD from Stanford. And one of his advisors there was David Layton, whom some of you may remember because David used to teach here. And in fact, David was, I think, the second member of the political science department here. And I think the first member was Peter Cowie, the former dean of our School of Global Policy and Strategy. So that's a nice pedigree. And Jesse was an expert in international relations, which is why we hired him. But it so happened that his specialty is what other old people like me and many of you, remember we used to call something the Soviet Central Asia? We don't say that anymore, but that is really sort of what in your brain you keep. What are these countries? It's Soviet Central. It's the republics of that part of the world, and that the former Soviet Central Asia was one of Jesse's major specialties. It's how those countries evolved, what kind of political systems they evolved. And well, that turns out to be it was an important topic then when he was doing it, but it's become a very important topic. And his dissertation was about that, and his first book called Warlords and Coalition Politics in Post-Soviet States was his book, published with one of the best presses in the world for such things as Cambridge University Press. And then he also wrote a book on doing global fieldwork. And then he started to write a book which actually became even more important, and it's this book that you see in front of you, which is what we're going to talk about today, is the Ukraine's Unnamed War. And it's very interesting for what we're going to talk about. This is central to what we're going to talk about. Jesse started to write this book before there's a war over there. This isn't a book about the war, because there was no war when he started to do it. I suppose the title is affected by the fact that there is now a war, but the title is Ukraine's Unnamed War. So Jesse, why did you call it that? No, that's too fast. I'm not supposed to transition that. That's a very terrible thing to do. Don't ever do that when you're done. But it is very important to what we're talking about, because very big theme in Jesse's book is what is it exactly? It isn't, and this is what's exciting in talking to Jesse, this isn't, what Jesse's ideas about this is not, they're not conventional, or at least it's not when you watch the news, listen to the news, you read about it, it's not the way you read and hear about it all the time. And so I'd like to share with you what I've learned in reading this is to have Jesse explain to us what strikes him as different, what's your way of thinking about this, which is so different. Why is it an unnamed war? And what is it about this that makes it distinctive and special to you, that makes it hard to come out with the conventional categories that we normally read about wars and the different sides and what's going on? I mean, there's lots of questions. So when you and I have prepared this, we've tried to break this down into pieces. So Jesse and I are going to talk for about a half an hour, going to ask him questions, and then we're going to turn it over and share the questions with you. So Jesse, let's start with this. What is it about this? What motivated you to do this even before there was no war? What are the special features about this that make it distinctive to you?
Well, thanks for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. I have been really honored to be a member of the faculty of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Before then, it was called the School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, and the University of California, San Diego has been a great intellectual home to me, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. And that's the first most important thing to say. To all of you, thank you. The second very important thing to say is that this is a co-authored book with Dominique Arel. So the ideas are not all my own. Most of the mistakes are. But Dominique is a very important character for me because he has a kind of expertise that I don't have. He is the chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa, the Danilou chair. He speaks fluent Ukrainian. And he is very, very invested in making sure that as we are trying to curate historical memory of this war, not only that it's bulletproof, that we dot our I's and cross our T's, but that we are not inadvertently reproducing anything that might be confused with Russian misinformation or disinformation. So this was not one of those rush-to-print jobs where a war broke out and then we did what political scientists do sometimes as ambulance chasers, which is try to get a book into print as fast as possible. We went slow with this, and that's because of the influence of Dominique. And I want to honor him and thank him for that, because I think it's more likely to stand the test of time because of that. Now, to answer your question on point, why do we call it an unnamed war? There's a couple of different reasons. First, when you think about war, oftentimes you're thinking about tanks and bombs and snipers and military equipment. People who think about war in a more long-term sense also add pieces to that. You start talking about the nationalist motivations that cause people to fight, or whatever motivations also are driving the combatants. And then you get into the realm of what you might call information warfare or narrative warfare. And because this is a conflict where information has played such an important role, it's notable that the politics we're really describing are the politics of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, both at war with each other, starting in around 2014, without either of them wanting to call it a war. And so that's the first reason that we named the book the way we do, is because there are clearly things that are recognizable as social scientists that we would call an interstate war. But that's not what the Ukrainians called it. They called it an anti-terrorist operation. Then they changed the name a little bit to something long and complicated. Putin, by contrast, would call it a civil war. Russia's narrative was that this was a civil war. And the way they were using that term was ludicrous. It was to claim that they had nothing to do at all with the violence taking place. It was civil war, it's a completely Ukrainian matter. Who? Us? And it was designed to be offensive and troll people. And so, in that world, you've got the Russians using one set of terms, the Ukrainians using the other set of terms, clearly trying to shape the information space, while neither of them really wanting to admit that they were at war with one another. And that has been going on since 2014. So the period between 2014 and the full-scale military invasion of 2022 is what this is a history book about. It's recent history. We have a chapter, of course, the obligatory, going back hundreds of years. A lot of people died in Ukraine during World War II, all of that. There's a chapter for that, for introduction. But really, it's a local history of towns and villages, most of whom are Russian-speaking, between more or less February 22nd, 23rd of 2014, and the decision by Vladimir Putin to invade in a full-scale way, obviously on February 24th of 2022. Our book ends on that day. We try to psychologize Vladimir Putin a little bit, but this is not the best book on the current war. The best book on the current war is yet to be written. Those of you who are interested in the current war have to get your news source from somewhere, so I will plug the journalism and analysis of Michael Kaufman. Most of what I say when I'm forced to answer those questions is just plagiarizing him, so I might as well just say it up front. Michael Kaufman, he's really good, K-O-F-M-A-N. But there's another problem here, which is that you have to call it something. In the course of doing social science, at a certain point, you have to invoke analytical categories. And we found it useful, Dominique and I found it very useful, to think about this conflict as a series of events essentially initiated by violent politics in 2014 that changed the government. There's not that much that the Russian and Western narratives actually agree on. But one thing that both agree on is that the conflict, the chain of events leading to the conflict, began in in the square, in the Maidan square. And so that's where we start our story too. And I think what's a little different from the standard narrative are two things. First, in the standard narrative, I think a lot of well-meaning people, without really meaning to, end up inadvertently recreating Russian talking points. And they do that by framing this as a conflict that pits Russia against the West. And that's a good thing to want to do if you're an American, because you want to be taking part in this war, and you think Putin is bad. But what is often done in that is you obliterate the actual lived experience of Ukrainians in your rush to claim victory in the West. And Putin wants very badly for this to be a conflict between Russia and the West, because that lets him claim that poor little Russia just wanted to be left alone. And that, of course, is not the intent of everyone who does that. I myself do it all the time when I'm teaching. I'll probably do it during this talk. But you should just notice how easy it is to omit Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian suffering, details about Ukraine can easily be lost in that big, sweeping geopolitical narrative. And Dominique and I wanted to document those details, and so we did. The second thing real quick.
Go ahead. No,
yeah,
go
no, sure.
ahead.
The second thing about it real quick is that with our effort here, we have tried to curate a story where Ukrainians, many of whom speak Russian at home but have Ukrainian passports in 2014, are the real heroes and the real villains, where Ukrainians have a lot of agency in our story. And that is important to both of us for normative reasons as historians, and we also just think it's important for telling a clear history, as clear a history as possible. So I'll leave it at that, but that's what we wanted to do.
Well, I wonder if you could continue in a way in a line that you just brought up, which is that one of the difficult things for me is trying to, an understanding, and I read these passages several times, and you and I talked about this, and I wonder if you could share it with them. Explain who is on each side. In a civil war, you imagine people within one space are fighting each other. And I having trouble understanding exactly who it is, and one of the most confusing things is that I think in the book you challenge the idea that it's Ukrainian speakers versus Russian speakers, that is actually not accurate and primitive. So explain to me that the way I understand is you have Russian speakers who are pro-Ukrainian. And I wonder if you could talk about that for a while. Who is on each side? How do you get Russian speakers who are pro-Ukrainian? I don't know if there are Ukrainian speakers who are pro-Russian, but there certainly are Russian speakers who are pro-Ukrainian. So
most people,
could you talk about that for a while?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, most people in Ukraine are bilingual or trilingual or multilingual. So the traditional way of framing Ukrainian politics, to be crude about it, is that there is an East-West split with Ukrainian speakers, proud Ukrainians further west, and Russian speakers, more Russophile, oftentimes proud Russians, in the Far East. And there was a peaceful rotation of power that took place between these social forces, and that balance of power held peacefully until 2014. In fact, in 2014, the government that was in charge was traditionally thought of as a quote-unquote pro-Russia government, because it was a government that catered to the social interests in the Far East, company towns that were dependent on free trade with Russia, people who spoke Russian at home, people who believed that they ought to have a legal right to speak Russian in court, not really learn Ukrainian, and other things too, related to social memory, related to preferences for or against NATO. In all of these ways, it was easy to, in journalistic shorthand, code the government that was in charge in Ukraine as a pro-Russian government. It represented the Russian East, and that was what that was code for. And then that government was removed from power due to a change of government, which was, it was legal, but it was irregular. And that is because violence took place in that irregular power shift. It led to a perception by some Ukrainians, some Russian-speaking Ukrainians living in the East, that what had just taken place was fundamentally illegitimate and was a coup. And that justified in their minds what Dominique and I call an insurrection or an insurgency in the Far East. Now, there's also the matter of Crimea, where you have not only a bottom-up insurgency, but also the intervention by Russia very, very early in the game with little green men. So we have we have a couple different things going on very rapidly, and it's very confusing. And it took us a couple of years to try to sort out exactly, our version of the flow of events. But the real story, in quick summary, is that Vladimir Putin seems to have had a theory that if you spoke Russian at home and you voted for the Party of Regions and you were kind of from the East, you were quite likely to want to opt out of the Ukrainian state if we give you the chance. If we take Crimea and it's quick and clean, that creates in everyone's mind a historically unprecedented situation, because that hasn't happened in a long time, a big country just taking a little piece of a small neighbor. That was pointed out by US diplomats at the time. That sounds illegal to me. But nonetheless, if you're living in Ukraine, that had happened, right? It's not an abstract thought experiment. It's a real thing that just happened. And so what do you do? Putin seems to have had a theory, Russia seems to have had a theory that they could get much of Ukraine on the cheap, that they could just wait around for people in Odessa, people in Kharkiv, people in Kherson, to rise up, take up arms against the government, and then Russia would be able at some point to show up at the last minute like a soccer ref and probably end up claiming that it had saved a lot of lives, cauterizing an ugly civil war, and just coincidentally they end up with, I don't know, the whole north shore of the Black Sea. And that I suspect that was the plan. And that didn't come to fruition because it turns out that the Russian speakers were actually, most of them, when the chips were down, not interested in opting out of the Ukrainian state. The streets were actually pro-Ukrainian. So what was described in the Russian media as a Russian spring, in the end, the dominoes don't fall and it turns out to be a Ukrainian spring. The exception to this, the one place where the dominoes do begin to fall, is the heartland of power for that pro-Russia party I was talking about before, which is now the eastern, like you guys saw these maps of the DNR, LNR, that's the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. That's where people seize government buildings, never quite let them go. But that's not the entire oblast of Luhansk or Donetsk. It's only really a little rump east of both of them. And that's where we see an insurgency that was basically failing before Russia intervened in August in order to cauterize things. That intervention in August at the Battle of Ilovaisk is what created the Minsk Accords, and the conflict remained more or less frozen, though there were some additional things. But that's the story, Peter, is that the temptation by people to rush in and say, oh, Ukraine is fighting, it must be Western Ukrainians against Eastern Ukrainians. I think that's one of the many things that's misleading that we were trying to take a giant step back from when you look at the data from a distance. It's pretty clear that the dominoes were either going to fall or not fall in the East and in the South, because that's where all the Russian speakers lived. And it was their hearts and minds that were being fought over, and still are.
So you date that back to 2014, that this Russian-speaking pro-Ukrainian population was quite real.
Very real.
Already back to then, and that is a really deep misunderstanding by everybody who talks about it of the situation.
I think so. It's certainly a misunderstanding by military analysts in Russia who made the same mistake in 2022, seeming to genuinely believe by watching a lot of Crimea game tape over and over again that if they just did it with 10,000 times as many people, they only really sent 68 folks to Crimea, and they got Crimea. So, okay, do some back of the envelope, algebra, and how many guys is it going to take? I think that that's what they believed. And that stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Ukrainian society, from my perspective, from Dominique's perspective. Of course, we get to Monday morning quarterback it, but it seems pretty clear to me that they just weren't paying attention to anything that took place in Ukraine outside of Crimea. In the social sciences, we call that selecting on the dependent variable, and we throw you out of graduate school. In the real world, there's no consequences, because it's really just what's going on in the head of one guy.
Mm-hmm. Well, take us back to...
I'm glad you laughed at that. I'm glad you guys liked that. That was good. I've been sitting on that one.
That's a very hard thing to do with graduate students, because they do it all the time.
Yeah. We don't really throw them out of graduate school, I should also say.
Well, we tell them 5 times. Talk more about what happened from what happened between 2014 and 2022? I just forget we're in 2023, so the war started in 2022.
Yeah,
What
sure.
got us from that situation in 2014 to the war actually taking place? Why did nothing happen for or at least the kind of war we're having now? Why did we get for that 8 years without a war, and what then happened?
Well, for a very long time, people who were scholars specializing in this part of the world had a baked-in assumption that the status quo, from Russia's perspective, was essentially sustainable, which is to say, they had a rump state, unrecognized but de facto real, on the territory of Ukraine. They also had Crimea, which Russia claimed as its own territory, contra the DNR-LNR, which even though they had votes trying to join Russia, Russia never recognized. So they had a bargaining chip that they could give back to Ukraine in exchange for something. Like, what did they think they were going to get? They thought that they would eventually get leverage over the Ukrainian polity by recreating the Party of Regions. If you let these people vote, eventually we will be able to use that as a lever to get what we had before, which was influence over the politics in Kiev. Now, that's if the Minsk Accords are implemented. The Minsk Accords weren't implemented because the Ukrainian diplomatic and military position was essentially, why would we do that? Why in the world would we do that? And furthermore, we don't actually believe that if we do that, the Russian military will leave. And furthermore, you could make it really easy by admitting that the Russian military is there in the first place, which you still haven't done, and or leaving, and then we'll implement the Minsk Accords. And the Ukrainian diplomatic position was backed de facto by most of the West. If you look at the constant re-upping of IMF packages and World Bank packages, Ukraine got a lot of assistance. Military assistance as well, but economic assistance, and military assistance in this context supported the Ukrainian position because everyone was, I think rightly, outraged about the Crimea precedent and wanting to make sure that there were some consequences. And the best way to have those consequences felt in Russia, it's not just economic sanctions. It's hard to know what those even did. But keeping Ukraine from imploding, that denies Putin what he wants. And so that was Western policy. So neither side wants to budge. And I think that, to get back to what I was saying before, there was a going assumption that Russia was just going to be able to wait them out. And what you see in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, what you see in Moldova with Transnistria, what you see in Nagorno-Karabakh in a slightly different way, is that Russia has a long, patient approach to its periphery. It breaks countries. It waits around for a decade until those countries notice that Russia actually cares about the outcome more than anybody in the West does. People in the West have fairly short attention spans and elections, which force them to have short attention spans. Russia has a long attention span, and its elections don't change governments in quite the same way. And that it's cynical as the day is long, but it's consistent. And so Dominique and I, when we wrote the book, when the book, in fact, was submitted to the press, we had an assumption that's the future, that what's really going to happen is Russia implementing a squeezing long-term exhaustion strategy, and that could go on and on and on. And it turns out that we were wrong about that. It turns out that for Putin, the status quo was not sustainable. And this is where our book, I think, is actually a contribution. Our book explains how Ukrainian society adapted to the Russian presence. I want to give a flag also to my colleague Paul Denari at UC Riverside. He's the first person to really do the electoral math on the impossibility of ever putting the Party of Regions back together once you subtract Crimea in a pretty compelling way. Even if you let the DNR, LNR populations vote, and even if you inflate their numbers, which of course would probably happen through some kinds of chicanery, you never really get more than 14 votes in the Rada or 15 votes in the Rada.
DNR means Donetsk.
I apologize, yeah, Donetsk and Luhansk, DNR, LNR, they're the two rump republics in
right,
the...
way off in the east.
Yeah, the war-torn parts of the east. even if those votes were counted, Dominique and I came to the conclusion, the analytic conclusion, that the existence of the Zelensky coalition, Zelensky, recall, is from the East. He's a Russian speaker. He is voted into power against Petro Poroshenko, who represented the standard political bloc of someone from the far west, from Lviv. He ran in 2019 on a very traditional Ukrainian blood and soil against the Russians type platform, and he lost to this comedian from the East, who won the plurality of votes all around the country. And what Zelensky represented was a populist, potentially transactional player, but someone who was not going to back down to Russia the way that Russia, I think, unrealistically hoped that he would. And we have only limited understanding of what Vladimir Putin really believes, but we have some texts. We have this manifesto that he published a couple summers ago, and he says quite clearly in that one of the core sources of his frustration is that he believes in his heart that Ukrainians are actually Russians, and Ukraine is actually part of the greater Russian world. And while there are some Ukrainians who don't understand that that is true, those people are wrong. And in the future, the inevitable future that he calls into existence with this trick, they will be subordinated to the Russian truth. And he voices frustration in that at Ukrainian leaders running on one platform and then doing something else once they're in power as a particular focal point. So I think that Vladimir Putin understood that he wasn't actually ever going to get Ukraine. So he had to break Ukraine. That is what I think.
I mean, so elaborate on this point. I think there's a part of the very different understanding. You and I talked about these different narratives that if you look at the situation of 2014 or even before down to the present, the way in which Putin would talk about it and the way in which the West talk about it are just incredibly different. They're completely different understandings of what happened. I mean, what happened in the what do we call it? The Orange Revolution? What happened in Maidan? The 24.
Maidan. Yeah. So the Orange Revolution is a separate event. What happened in Maidan? We have a chapter on this. What happened in Maidan was, I have to be a little bit careful here, because I don't want this to be maliciously edited on the internet. But what happened on Maidan was a great deal of violence. The police are responsible for that violence. The police, snipers and general terror tactics by the Berkut are if there's a bad guy, it's them. However, there were strategic decisions made, not at the central cell of Maidan, nothing like that, but in the street, there were strategic decisions that were made by some actors to use violence to provoke the police to do even more. And that was ultimately successful in causing a regime change.
Do you guys,
is that following?
Everybody know what we're talking about? We're talking about the guy who's the president who suddenly says we're not going to allow Ukraine to join the West. We're going to go loyal to the East. There's a big demonstrations and they throw him out and he runs away to Russia, right? That's the summary of that's
a pretty good summary. Yeah, he flees very unexpectedly in the middle of the night.
Right. So
and the unexpectedness of it is a huge part of the story. Is the contingency involved here is really incredible. The guy could have stuck around and mobilized the Party of Regions to say, hey, that was an illegal seizure of power. That's a coup. And once he's in Russia, he can't do that anymore. I think a lot of people expected him to do that. A lot of people in the Party of Regions did. In fact, before he fled to Russia, it turns out he fled to Kharkiv. You didn't know that. You've got to read a book. Yeah, which is in Ukraine. And he's there, and then he goes to Russia. So there was a moment where the Party of Regions was reorganizing. The Party of Regions, I apologize, but that's the Eastern Party. They're actually trying to get their act together to reorganize and that would have given them an institutional base for a much larger insurgency, right? They might have been able to get the military involved or the police involved. They might have been able to make credible international law arguments. I mean, who knows what would have happened? They wouldn't have been credible to the U.S. government, but who knows what would have happened? and then he's gone. That's just the contingency of life. There's a lot of human agency there. So the narratives that you're talking about, at this point, the Russian government is describing this as a fascist coup by Nazis backed by NATO. They do not back down from those talking points for months. If you watch Russian television, for months you just hear coup, NATO, Nazis, fascists on repeat, 24 hours a day. And this has two purposes. One is obviously domestic political consumption within Russia, because Vladimir Putin has now, having invested a lot in trying to pull Ukraine into Russian orbit, it's now clearly gone. So he needs to somehow cover that story. The other thing that it does is it is an invitation to Russian speakers who get their news in the Russian language from Russia living in Ukraine. So when I said before that the narrative has a warfare component, I think that the right way to understand the Russian narrative is as an invitation to opt out of an illegitimate government, and calling it a coup activates that. Now, in the West, we like to use the term the revolution of dignity. We don't like to focus on the violence at all, and to the extent that we do focus on the violence, we do what I just did, which is we say, well, you started it, or the police started it. And that's also, by the way, totally factually true. And most of the people who were on Maidan were peaceful and heroic, which is also factually true. And I have to admit, I'm a little biased towards the Western narrative, actually, as I start going through it here. But that's not the point. I mean, of course I'm biased. I worked in the US government, and I'm an American voter. The point is that the narratives never come back together. The Russians stay on this idea that a coup took place, it was probably a CIA coup, and, okay, but who cares? It was clearly a coup, and after that, Russians were threatened, and we had to come to their rescue. The reason that they focus so much on the need to come to their rescue, an imminent threat, is because they like to hijack Western international law talking points from responsibility to protect, going back to Kosovo. We have developed a whole architecture of international law since Rwanda in order to try to strong-arm the powerful countries in the world to intervene when there is atrocity. And so Russia can never admit that there was no atrocity. They have to stick to the line that everything we have done is to try to protect our people who are under imminent threat. This is anathema to Ukrainians, to Ukrainian nationalists, but also to just a lot of non-nationalistic Ukrainian patriots of one stripe or another who are not, capital U Ukrainians. I don't want to get into any of that. It's just wrong. It's anathema because it's just wrong. Nonetheless, it is a point that is amplified on Russian television. So that's, I think, the answer.
So your view is that so Putin launches the war last year because he cannot stand the thought. He now if he doesn't do it, he's going to lose Ukraine. Ukraine's going to go into the other orbit, and he can't abide that.
I think that's a succinct statement of something I think is
I got
true.
it from you, Jess. It's not.
No, that's right.
No, but that's
right.
Yeah.
By this point, Ukraine has adapted in a number of different ways. They've changed their constitution to validate that they are going to be a NATO aspirant country, and that change was made before Zelensky was brought in. So the concern by the outgoing coalition was, what if Zelensky comes in and wants to renege on NATO because he's a comedian and he thinks it's funny? We can't just have the head of state reversing all of the work we've done for the last 5 years, so they changed the constitution. That's one of many things we talk about in chapter 8 of our book. These are the adaptations. Again, Ukrainian heroes and villains here, but these were Ukrainian choices that they made. Here's a different one. Autocephaly from the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no undo on that. Bartholomew made a choice, and now there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church which is not subordinate to the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no backsies that happened. Changes like that. A third would be the language laws that Ukraine passed in 2019, which are designed, I think it is fair to say that they are designed to disincentivize the teaching of Russian in schools. So the Russian language will be taught less in the future. We know how these laws work, and the people who study this stuff would notice that the Ukrainian language laws look an awful lot like the Estonian language laws. They're designed to make parents make choices to put their kids in Ukrainian language schools, not Russian language schools. Now, Vladimir Putin looks at that, and he calls that genocide. That's what he actually says. That I apologize for reproducing that point in a public forum, but it is important factually to understand that that is exactly what he says. Now, that's offensive, by the way, to anyone who's an actual victim of genocide, but that's what he says. And then he goes on to kill a lot of Russian speakers in the East in a war that he started.
Jess, I can think of 10 more questions, but if I ask them, there will be no time for our audience. So let's now, since we don't have lots more time, let's turn it over and allow you the opportunity to ask questions. We have a couple people with microphones, and since we are trying to tape this, please raise your hands, and so the mic people can come up to you. And I think the microphone's just been given to the gentleman back there in the tan. So, sir, go ahead.
Hello. Would it be fair to say that the European Union, NATO, and the United States was hoping the integration of Russia into their economy played a big role in where we are today? Your thoughts on that?
So the question is whether the hope in the West that Russia would integrate with the West, or had played a part in that?
Join the European Union, join NATO, which never happened. But.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to wind the game clock all the way back to the 1990s, I think there were some missed opportunities to create a version of the security architecture of Europe where Russia was more of a stakeholder. And so we're now decamping from the local details of the book and going up to that IR criticism that I was getting at before. But from an IR perspective, you could say that part of the problem is that when Putin decides that he's lost Ukraine, there's not a lot of carrots left on the table. And that might have been different if different countries had made very different decisions in the 1990s. But the relationship with Russia never got very far past the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And the text of the NATO-Russia Founding Act has a lot of things in it that seem very dated. Optimism about a democratic Russia and other things like that. So I think there's both supply and demand problems in terms of the integration. And I don't think most people believe that there's any chance at all that Russia is going to be invited to join either NATO or the European Union in our lifetime. And that sets Ukraine up as a friction point because it becomes zero-sum for Ukrainians. And that's, to Peter's reference before, that's what was weaponized on Maidan. Maidan got started because of something that seems pretty esoteric, which is free trade with the EU or and membership with the EU or membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. But you can't easily do both. And once people figured that out, it mobilized a lot of people around their children's life opportunities if they were forced to direct their economy east towards Russia, because that would foreclose opportunities west. So,
great. Here's a question
that
here.
was Maidan.
If you have more questions, please raise your hand so that the mic people can find you. There's a question there.
Thanks for doing this forum. Really appreciate it. My wife was in the first graduating class of the Pacific International Affairs, so I'm going to take this off. Awesome. I disagree with what a lot you have to say, and I'm an American citizen. I used to work for the government as well, and I'm not biased. So I have a bunch of things, but some questions for you is, who do you think's responsible for the Nord Stream bombing pipeline and the Crimean Bridge, the Zaporizhia nuclear facility, the bombing in Moscow, the car bombing, and the cafe bombing in St. Petersburg? Do you have a sense of who's responsible? Because to me, it's very clear.
So I just read the news. What do you mean when to you it's pretty clear? What are you implying in your question?
Well, who gains from the Nord Stream pipeline being bombed? It's not Russia. And by the way, it released the largest amount of methane gas in the history of mankind. It was Joe Biden on February 12th of 2022, before the war started. He said, we will not allow the Nord Stream pipeline to exist. And then Victoria Nuland, a couple weeks later in front of Congress, said the same thing. Russia invades in September, the Nord Stream pipeline's bombed up. And then Seymour Hersh gave the final answer to that, the guy who broke the My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib. So it was very clear, obviously, and the same with the Crimean Bridge. Why would Russia do that, as the West claims? It's very obvious. And I also disagree with you that Putin has wanted war with NATO or with the West. It's just the opposite. Otherwise, the West would not have been expanding to Russia's borders for the past 30 years, including adding another country yesterday in Finland, which has another 800 miles on border of Russia. I can't imagine in the United States if Russia, Iran, China was in Mexico, Canada, and threatening us. I would be certain what we would do.
So I think that's actually a fair point and well made. I think the United States would be apoplectic if China entered into a security agreement, mutual defense with Mexico. I think we would not like that at all. And I mean, to the extent that you want to treat this as a problem of a security dilemma between the United States and Russia, it's hard to know exactly what the United States ought to do, because there are a lot of other countries, other than those two countries in Europe, most of whom are the ones who want to be in this NATO alliance. And so to just blow up NATO completely and abandon Europe doesn't seem like it's in America's interest. And it is in the interest of most of those countries, at least their self-professed interest, to be part of the security alliance because of Russia's behavior. So that's how I would respond to all of that. Now, the details of bombings, I think, take us too far astray from anything that I'm really comfortable talking about. But I'm happy to talk with you afterwards if you want.
Based on your deep explorations of all these internal Ukrainian politics and social issues and language and affinities, it's identities and affinities, does that inform any possible ideas about what a stable outcome from the current war might be?
That's a really good question. And the lawyer's dodge is, no, of course not. I'm just a historian. But that's not fair. I think that there's meaningful variation between Crimea and the Donbas. So that's the first thing when I think about settlement to just notice. And that doesn't necessarily imply that Crimea ought to be Russia or anything like that. But it is notable. It's that when action was happening very, very quickly after the government change, during that chaotic period I was talking about, the real story of Maidan is not just taking place in the main square in Kiev. The real story is that there's social mobilization, massive social mobilization rocking the whole country. Major demonstrations that are both pro and anti-Russia, pro and anti-West, clashing all over the South and the East. And the one exception to that, the one place where the pro-Ukrainian position has no ground game whatsoever is Crimea. There's just hegemony on the streets by the pro-Russia presence. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the median voter wanted to be part of Russia or anything like that. I think that the referendum was probably just faked. I think people voted, but I think 97% is absurd. We write all this in the book. But if you get out of the weeds and get up to 30,000 feet, I have a really difficult time understanding how in any settlement Crimea is Crimea's a tough one. I mean, it's different than what takes place everywhere else in Ukraine. So that's just the first thing I would say. That's kind of a soft policy implication of the research that we did. It doesn't mean that anything that took place in 2014 is dispositive either, because the demographics have changed since 2014, and that's the result of strategic state policies. Now, the other thing that I think is important to lay out completely clearly here is I am not optimistic about settlement in the near term. And that is because the Russian narrative of this war is just so distant from the Ukrainian narrative of this war. I think it's much more likely that they're going to end up in a war of attrition And we've studied war of attrition dynamics in political science to death. It's one of the main things we do in IR. These things can go on well past the point that it is rational for either side to stop. That happens in nature all the time, and it happens in the interstate system all the time. If you look at how the Korea War ended, the lines didn't shift that much, and they kept dying by the thousands for years and years and years. And I worry that that is the case that we're in. There are even darker scenarios for ways that this could go on, but keep Korea in your head as a possible outcome. And it's very premature at this point to talk in specifics about a settlement when both sides are so far apart from each other about what they're even fighting over. I mean, the Russian narrative, again, can't back down from the claim that they are protecting Russians from genocide. And that claim is so absurd to Ukrainians. They don't know how to sit down at a table and meet the Russians halfway on a treaty that is titled, on the protection of Russian people and the right to speak Russian language in Ukraine. That it would be very difficult to imagine a Ukrainian president signing that and surviving.
You have a question?
Surviving politically, I mean.
Can you give us a sense of typical views, both by the Ukrainians and Russians in Russia, about the narrative that they trust or ascribe to, or the two narratives that you described?
Sure.
What's the average person thinking?
I mean, it's difficult to make sweeping claims about what an average person is thinking when you don't trust most of the survey data in Russia. And I have a hard time with the Levada Center's polling on a lot of this because it's just not that informative. But in caricature, if I were going to give you a little character vignette, I think that the typical story for a lot of Russians is NATO has been expanding really aggressively. Russia is encircled. Russia has been humiliated at every turn. And people don't understand that Ukraine is a fake state, and that if you just really look at the sweep of human history, we are family with Ukraine. A small number of Ukrainians are pretending that we're not family, but we actually are. And sometimes families fight. Sometimes you don't always love your family. I don't always love my family. But, I get that because it's a family matter, and we are family. We are blood. We're not like the Germans. We're not like the Kazakhs. We're not like any number of other people. But Ukrainians are Russians, and the West needs to respect that this is a family matter and stay off our lawn. That is what I think a fair statement of what most people in Russia think. Now, what most people in Ukraine think is we got invaded. Russia only understands violence. My grandparents suffered in World War II, and I would be dishonoring them if I allowed the same thing to happen again. We need to settle this once and for all, and there needs to be an understanding by Russia that they can't just do this in years. We can't have a kind of a settlement that gives up anything, because that just encourages whoever comes after Putin to do this again. And so anything short of total territorial, 1991 borders, which is what they agreed to by a treaty, is completely unacceptable. Those two narratives are very distant from one another. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, so that's the problem.
I'd like to know a little more about language policy. Language is so symbolically important to identity. And immediately after the Maidan, I seem to recall that the language policy was very, very sort of focused against the use of Russian in public spaces, the use of Russian. And you had mentioned a sort of a push to avoid having parents take their kids to Russian medium schools as opposed to Ukrainian. But I'd like to know, was there a lot more than that? Do I have the wrong impression that it was really fairly strong? I remember Putin himself saying at one point you could push a spring only so far before it springs back, and I thought of it at the time in connection with fairly severe language policy from that government?
So thanks for asking. It's a really, really good question. I think Putin's spring was about NATO expansion, but nonetheless, the point is valid and well taken, and the points get conflated later, so it doesn't matter that much. The analogy is a good one. Just to lay the facts out here, what had happened is that in 2012, the government, and remember this is a pro-Russia, Eastern-oriented government, had passed a language law which made it essentially legalized the use of Russian in all public spaces, allowing you to, for instance, apply for a government job without speaking Ukrainian or filling out a Ukrainian language form, to testify in court without having a Ukrainian translator there. And this is the kind of thing that if you speak Russian at home and you answer on a survey, yes, I plan to have my grandchildren speak Russian at home. I'm not Russian, I'm Ukrainian, but I certainly prefer to speak Russian. You'll find a lot of people who will agree with those sentiments in eastern Ukraine. And those were the people who voted in this language law. Now, in the chaos of the post-regime change implosion of the Party of Regions, the very first substantive thing that the new government did was repeal that 2012 law. And that was in my view, that was a huge narrative warfare, information warfare mistake, because it allowed Russia to then say, the new government is full of fascists who want to ban Russian. Now, did they want to ban Russian? No, they wanted to, in their terms, remove a unfair subsidy that was being given to Russian speakers who were disloyal. But it had, in our telling, it did have a feeling of an emotion to it, and that emotion would be spite. We have just finally succeeded, and unfortunately, from my perspective, what they chose to do was not pass a symbolic resolution saying, we'd like to be part of Europe. We'd like to be part of the West. That's why we did this. What they did instead was the first thing they did was go after the language issue. And that validated the worst casing of the Russian media story. The Russians had to make up a bunch of other stuff, right? They had to fabricate a Ukrainian, crucified a Russian boy. Well, where's the video of that? Well, I don't have it on me, but people have been saying, look, that's happening. But the language issue is real. I don't want to get into the details of the law, but it doesn't matter because all that comes later. What passes in 2019 is actually much more stringent than just repealing the law. So those changes have taken place. And I'm a political scientist on this. I view the changes as essentially the result of a different median voter. If you remove the votes, again, from Crimea and the DNR, LNR, American politics would look really, really different if you removed all the votes in California and all of the votes in New York, right? You'd have a very different politics in this country. So I view that realignment as the rationale for that story. But it does feel emotional to a lot of people. I mean, language is right up there with how elementary school textbooks are rendered and geopolitics, with things that will really motivate people and really put them in the street. And a lot of that historically in Ukraine has broken east-west, and it's felt zero-sum. And what changed in 2014 was that it became violent.
We have time for one more question. Yes, go ahead, please.
I want to be more optimistic on behalf of Ukraine. What happens? I know there could be so many scenarios. What would happen if Ukraine drives Russia out of Ukraine, given the so many modern weapons?
Yes.
From the United States, from Germany, from England, from France? Do you think Putin might really use nuclear weapons?
I thought you were trying to make this optimistic, sir.
Or
you head
do you
faked me
think
there.
if they win that Ukraine can join the European Union and NATO as well? You being the expert on the country, can you give us the possible best scenario?
Can I read the tea leaves? So, with all of the normal caveats that we don't have time for about me just making stuff up, I think Stephen Kotkin wrote something very wise which is that Ukrainians are the ones who need to define their own version of victory here, and having a bunch of people in California define what Ukrainians should want is probably bound to backfire. And then he goes on to tell them what they should want, which is they should want to be in the EU. That Ukrainian victory should depend less on the exact territory, which was what was embedded in your question, and more on membership in the European Union. And if you keep your eye on the ball, we'll probably, in some future optimistic version of a Ukraine, have 85 to 90% of what they really want, loading a lot into the word they. Now, they are getting a lot of weapons, and they might be able to push Russia back. We'll see. Ukraine has to do its offensive. But I think it is probably a mistake to pretend that I'm more optimistic about that offensive than I am. Russians are pretty dug in, and conventional warfare favors the defense, and there's a lot of them. And so I think it's more likely that the next offensive is going to look more like the slog in Kherson than the rout in Kharkiv. That's just my prediction. Finally, to the use of nuclear weapons. I don't really understand what Vladimir Putin gets in the short or long term by using nuclear weapons. In the long term, the one thing you could do that would guarantee that you have a nuclear-armed Ukraine in the future is to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine. And Ukraine has like 40 reactors, and I don't know how you keep them in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty if Russia uses. And I think that's an argument that Russians understand. In the short term, I think Russia is deterred because I think that there are a number of things that the Western powers, they have given weapons, but they haven't given that many as compared to what they could give. And they haven't done things to Russia because they have not wanted to fight a war with Russia. They have wanted Ukraine to not run out of ammo. But if Russia used nuclear weapons, I think that it would have real implications, and I think Russia, compared to that, probably likes the war that it has.
Another optimistic scenario.
Yes, sir.
I've heard rumors that people like to get rid of Putin.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think will happen?
Unfortunately, I can't assess Russian politics very much. Could be that the guy who comes after him couldn't possibly be any worse. Could be that he couldn't possibly be any worse. However, I think that whoever comes in will be essentially slave to the narratives that have been promulgating in Russia for the last 8 years. You can't hard turn and say everything that you have learned for the last 8 years about this conflict was fake news.
Without Putin, do you think there will be peace?
I think without Putin, peace is more likely.
Well, I am less optimistic than that, actually. I'm not sure that I agree with you. I think Putin, Putin's dug in personally, psychologically, I agree with that. But I think on the other hand, that entire elite is dug into that. The narratives that you've described are so widely believed that I don't know that anybody in that elite, anybody who replaces him is likely to be one of the fanatics who believes in the same Ukraine is an essential part of the Russian mir, or the Russian world. So I'm not optimistic about who is going to replace Putin is going to be any better. And I think that the whole thing depends on what you said a few minutes ago. It depends on how many Ukrainians are willing to die. It is not anybody else. The West is giving them weapons, but there are no Westerners dying except for some volunteers. And so that is a very difficult situation. Jess, I want to thank you on behalf of the audience. I think you've done a fantastically interesting talk for us and a lot of very interesting material. And thank you for doing it.
Thank you for coming.